Hello, everyone, and welcome to ICFAC. We're happy today to present the second Spaces of Exchange presented by Jacqueline Kok. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I'm going to hand over the floor now to Jacqueline. And please save your questions to the end and feel free to write them into the chat box. All right, good luck. Thank you.
All right, so hi everybody. Welcome to the second installment of Space of Exchange, generally hosted by ICFAC. My name is Jacqueline. I am the curator and creator of this program. For today's session, we will be talking about gender roles within and beyond the international Chinese community. With us, we have artists Jia Sung and Rosemary. Together, we will unpack how both artists channel, appropriate, and hijack the notions, meanings, and understandings of gender roles in their work and consider the implications behind this act. Before getting started, I just want to give a gentle reminder of the format of the session for those who are tuning in for the first time. We're going to start off with a 20 to 30-minute conversation between myself and the artists before moving on to a 20 to 30-minute public Q&A. So as Inez had mentioned, feel free to post any questions that might come up in our initial discussion in the chat box. So to briefly introduce our lovely guests, Rosemary is an Indigenous Taiwanese drag artist and performer and the winner of the 2018 Miss First Nation Taiwan. She lives and works in Taipei. Rosemary blurs the concept of gender, presenting her diverse works in the form of fashion and performance by combining her interest and knowledge of the Western drag landscape made popular by RuPaul's Drag Race with her Indigenous ancestry, where gender and sexuality do not conform to Western modern binaries. Jia Sung is an American-born Singaporean Chinese artist based in New York, and she's currently a teaching artist at Rhode Island School of Design. Sung grounds her works in well-known myths and legends, examining and questioning the appearance or lack thereof of cultural, post-colonial, and femme identity, using images, animal/human hybrids to speak to the nonlinear notions of identity, diaspora, language, history, and femininity. So jumping right in, I want to start our discussion with a couple of questions for you guys. So gender roles and certainly the imposition of the patriarchal Western construct of gender binary has greatly influenced the ways in which we perceive, interact, and form relationships with people. How has your work of decolonizing this construct developed alongside your career in your respective cities? So in other words, what brought you, Jia, to choose to subvert characters in Chinese mythology? And what drew you, Rosemary, to drag and the performance of drag? Whoever wants to start first.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you for that lovely introduction. Yeah, I think, for me, just starting off, I think, the interest in myth and folklore, I think definitely comes from this, I think inherited stories are so much of how we learn to understand ourselves and to see ourselves, in a way there's sort of like, ways that we learn to see ourselves, ciphers for self-understanding. And I think by that same note, they also serve as vessels in which we inherit or in which values are transmitted down to us, right? In this sort of very Trojan horse style. And so it's not just that we learn how to see ourselves, it's that we are taught how to see ourselves. I think in wanting to revisit this material, I'm very much interested in creating a space for reimagining ourselves and kind of exploring our relationship to the past, but also re-envisioning it. I think, right, especially with this sort of inherited story, right? That went from oral history to sort of the written record. It's like, well, who's doing the telling? Who's doing the record keeping? Who censors this work, right?
So I'm just going to share my screen to show some of the works that you have or that you've made most recently, and maybe if you want to kind of talk a little bit about those these projects, that would be great. So I'll just do that.
Absolutely.
Great. So here we go. There we go. I think it's
nice. Could we start with the tarot deck first, maybe?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, just very briefly, as introduction. So I think, a lot of my recent work in the last few years has centered around, Journey to the West, one of our most, our trademark Chinese inherited story. And I've been very repeatedly drawn back to this idea of not only this sort of like metaphorical journey, right, in which all the disciples represent like motivations of the heart, but also the figure of the monkey specifically, right, as the trickster, who is this, the archetype of this very liminal, ambiguous figure who has many faces, many traits, right, and kind of embodies a lot of dualities, right, like idiocy, wisdom, devotion, detachment, both wit and also like somberness, right? They're humorous, but they're also kind of a figure of pathos. And I was always very interested by the idea that the trickster is rarely female, right? And this led me down this line of inquiry about, well, what do we call clever women in mythology? Rather than trickster, is it that we remember them as witches, right, or sorceresses, and that their irreverence is not something endearing, but something threatening that pulls, that sort of provokes punishment. Yeah, and this is something that I'm interested in so many like Chinese classics. I mean, like I read San Sui Ping Yao Zhuan recently, the Three Suis Quell the Demon Revolt. Hate English translations of Chinese phrases. Anyway, but it's I thought that was really interesting. I think summarizes so much about what I think about what I'm interested about in these stories, right? It's there's the character of the sorceress Hu Yong'er, who leads a rebellion, but the whole novel seems very confused by itself. The story always sits at this edge of like, what is demonhood? What is monstrosity? What is perversity? And yeah, I just find that very compelling, especially in the lens of like, often not only typecasting, sort of dangerous women as other, but like queerness itself, right, is so often relegated to like the monster in the story. So yeah, this tarot deck was sort of like an initial exploration of these ideas, specifically with regard to like the monkey trickster figure, and then just wanting to reimagine what this arc of enlightenment that is traced throughout the tarot's major arcana looks like through the lens of Chinese mythology, and specifically the pantheon of Journey to the West. And then that led me to, so this is kind of like an initial iteration that led me to the work for a solo show last year at the Knockdown Center called Chaos Wins Lust, which sort of was a more, like a come around iteration, I guess, of these explorations. So it was a series of 50 drawings and poems together that kind of reimagined this journey, and also, Monkey and its chosen family as a sort of like queer and feminized story that kind of wove elements of autobiography. And so you can just kind of scroll.
So I particularly love that there's, and that you alluded to the idea of when we think about trickster as someone, as a female, usually instead of trickster we have witches, sorceress, and that's usually brings kind of like this negative connotation. And you mentioned the word punishment, which I think is absolutely true. And I just kind of wondered, while you were speaking, why did you choose tarot? Because if I understand correctly, tarot is a very Western kind of practice, and Journey to the West is obviously something that's very Eastern, very kind of embedded in our stories. So can you talk a little bit about that kind of connection that you made in your exploration, of the story and the kind of alternatives that could exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally I'm sort of interested in these sort of like almost like medieval, right? Like much more archaic systems of attempting to categorize and understand the world, right? Which I kind of see tarot and astrology as any sort of divination, and to be frank, it was also what was familiar, right?
Right.
I think that I have grown up in somewhat of a more Westernized context. I think this sort of re-entering and re-exploration of like Chinese inherited stories, right, is something that I've come back to in adulthood, right? And as a child, growing up in a post-colonial Singapore, who's like Chinese diaspora, also famously kind of like slightly illiterate and like not super good at Chinese, I think that there was some distance for me for a very long time. So this is all sort of like maybe a later life, return to wanting to connect with this. I think that so tarot as a system interests me. And also I think that, there's just always something fun about the act of translation, I guess, and, wanting to kind of flip this very codified iconography of tarot, right? Like, the Rider-Waite deck and so on, and so finding little moments of symbolism, that I, that could be sort of signified, I guess, right? Like the Wheel of Fortune is the Bhava Chakra, right? The wheel of reincarnation and so on. I think that sort of in some ways was like a very gentle research phase that kind of led me into this more loose, ambiguous exploration with the show. Yeah.
So I'm just going to scroll through the last few works that you have here.
Sorry, I also realize it's quite a lot of
No.
imagery and also a lot of words that just came out. So
it happens.
But what I find like super compelling about your works, and again, this is just my interpretation of it, is especially in kind of like the earlier works in this project, in this show, I was, it reminded me a lot about the story of the Buddha. There's the story of like how he became and how he reached nirvana,
right.
And it's like this idea of like, it was, he's a prince, he's given kind of, I think it was like his parents were told that, he would become a monk like at the age of 18 or something. So they trapped him. And so there's this whole like real, situation that we can imagine that existed. And for some reason, when I'm looking at, the works that you've done for your solo show, especially when you're tracing like that childhood, like, the monkeys in class and there's just something about, a spirituality, I guess I could say, that's really kind of embedded in it. But then at some point I'm like, oh, but I see the cross, like the Christian cross. And I'm thinking, oh, well, this weird fusion between religion, I found was, and that's kind of it shows in your tarot decks as well, this like kind of this kind of weird transition between one and the other, and that translation, and how things get lost in translation, but there's a beauty in that, is something that I particularly loved, and there's something so real about it as well, that there is no kind of one definition, and that you can exist in kind of like the liminalities, or like kind of the in-betweens, which I kind of I super am drawn to. So I'm just gonna finish up the last few.
Yeah, sorry, it does go on for you can scroll faster. But yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. And I think that reframing is really useful. I think that, yeah, that does come from, I guess, sort of my experiences, right? Where again, I sort of grew up like, Singapore was a British colony, I went to Catholic school, right? That's where a lot of this imagery comes from, like a super, queer repressive, like, mental illness denying kind of like very rigid educational system, right? That's embedded in a very strong religious foundation. And, yeah. I
And
guess oh, go ahead.
I didn't interrupt, go ahead.
Oh, no, just that, like, yeah, I guess that I cannot help but like make work that, kind of reflects both like a fascination with Catholic iconography and this sort of like Western spirituality, but also, yeah, the trappings of Chinese mythology and iconography, because that's kind of what I was fermented in.
Right. But that's actually such a nice segue, because I kind of wanted to talk to, or, bring this to Rosemary's practice too. Rosemary, we had obviously had the chance to speak prior to this session, and I, had the fortunate opportunity to kind of get into a lot of heavier, I guess, conversation. And we were talking about, the kind of like the colonization of the mind that had happened in Taiwan. Taiwan is like an island that had been colonized many times. Many people don't know that, but it was colonized by the Dutch, and then it was colonized by the Japanese and the Chinese. And throughout this process, our understandings of binary, of gender roles, gender construct has really changed. And I just kind of wanted to bring this to you and ask you kind of like, how do you feel that, your works has kind of been a part of that process of deconstructing the Western kind of mindset, even though you're working in like the, kind of, I don't want to say a Western, but, something that's been popularized, I guess, by the West. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just like you mentioned, we've been colonized by all the other countries, and also Spanish, yeah. And then I think it's it's not how I started doing drag, but throughout doing drag at Miss First Nation, working with different artists and kind of developing my drag persona with my culture as a indigenous Taiwanese. And it makes me, it's just like what I do is basically is already blurring the idea of genders that is being constructed by not just like Western culture, but also in Chinese culture, which is like male dominant culture. And also, especially for my tribe, which is Ataya, which is more male dominant culture. So there's very specific roles for females and very specific ones for males. They say hunting for males, taking care of the kids for females, kind of like Chinese culture. And I'm just like, what did I say it? But basically it's like doing this, it's, I mean, it's also a blast to be doing this in 2020, and when people are more interested in this kind of idea, which is more popular now, so it's great. And also I think we have this, our tribe also have this idea of like Native Americans, like the Two-Spirit identity. So, but it's not being talked about because of Christianity and colonization. And there's no, because how we preserve or record, document everything was like from verbal words instead of like books or written. Like we don't have written words for our languages. So I just strongly believe that we have two spirits in all those tribes, all of villages across Taiwan, just like Native Americans. And I happen to find some documents or some professors that I know that talk about this idea. So I just take on this and I yeah, and also when I talk with friends, we often talk about like we say witch or sorcerers. That's how you say it.
Mhm.
Yeah, is very in a higher ranking of a society. It's like he helps maintain the the order of the society, and he takes it's playing a very strong and very important role in every society, and like the mediator. So and I believe that, but we cannot know now because nothing is being documented. It's being colonized. But I just I have this belief that it was there. So I think this is something I mostly take on with my drag, which is like combining this and use this art form to present it to people, because I feel like in a way in 2020 drag, it's a way to make people feel or entertain or make people feel something else. And when you have these voices, I use like big personality and it's like man in the dress, maybe you can present idea better. So people, this kind of voice can be heard. So I want to, just like go on with this kind of identity, yeah, that I believe in.
I'm just going to show some of the kind of works that you've done and the performance that you've done, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about kind of the inspiration behind combining drag with your indigenous ancestry that you did in Pulima, so or First Nation Taiwan show. So let me just share screen again. I hope this works.
Yeah. Because before everything, this is one of the picture with actually what I wear right now actually. So it's the same dress, but some alterations to it. But for me, it's like this is the first time I feel extremely comfortable combining my drag with my indigenous identity, because before I feel like what I think drag is more like entertainment, it's more like campy, more like funny ones, and usually it's being performed in nightclubs or nightlives. And for me, as I have huge respect for my indigenous background, so at first I didn't want to put it together, but this is a um, perfect platform for me to do this. And when I do it, I do feel certain spiritual energy because I perform a traditional song that was back in the days was can be only sung by male. But then the person who passed down this music, this folk, this is traditional song was by a woman. And without her, we wouldn't listen to this song like ever, like it would be gone forever. And for that, I chose to do this because I'm a male physically, but I perform this song in a female facade, not really facade, but appearance. So it gives another depth to it. And when I did this song, I did feel like there's certain energy that came into my body that made me feel super emotional, and it felt like because before I was like so confused or conflicting with myself that should I do it because traditionally it is not how it is, but when I do it, it's just right. I feel like the ancestors from above tell me that what I do was right. That's why it gave me a lot of ideas of keep on developing my drag with my indigenous identity. Yeah, I think it's pretty magical. Oh yeah, this one. So this one is I did it in one of the space which more like more accepting of queer arts, and then but I don't want to be like too specific. So this is I chose a song from Aboriginal Australian artist called Electric Field, and then put in one of my performance with the things that I created and do a more conceptual things, but with a choreography that it's slightly similar to our, but I just want to present the idea of Aboriginal people instead of just like certain bugs, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So, oh yeah, and this one is I collaborated with a body painting artist, and the photographer is also a good friend of mine, which is from another tribe in Taiwan, and we just go together, talk about our idea with the myth, the legend of Ataya, and we create this look, which is like a bird, which is, you know, like a lot of Aboriginal culture, also in Chinese culture, I believe, like birds take some very important roles in telling you what's the future or what is going to happen, this and that. Yeah. So yeah, this is from the same photo shoot, but this is more like non-binary, gender fluid, like appear like as a boy, but with the painting here, but the makeup is still like drag makeup with my own naked body, but body painting. So yeah, pretty much that. Yeah. So it just also, yeah, it's basically how I see my drag now, my art with my identity and gender roles, basically.
Well, thank you. That was, beautiful and super informing. Oops. And I just feel like, what's kind of wonderful and the kind of connection between both your works is the idea of like subverting, right? Like something that we normally think that is, quote unquote normal, it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to prescribe to, like you said, Rosemary, like in this specific box. Like we don't have to understand things in a specific way. And the act of kind of weaving in and out of it is something that's both beautiful and really kind of eye-opening in the sense that there can be different ways of understanding this kind of non-Western knowledge that exists. So I think that that's kind of a beautiful way to segue into any questions that the audience may or may not have, since we've kind of hit the 20 to 30 minute mark. But if we don't have any questions, I can definitely kind of ask more. I have plenty in mind, but I guess we'll see if there's anything that kind of comes up. We don't see any just yet. But what I can do is, I'm just going to keep kind of going on until something shows up. So I guess my next question, which might sound a little silly or, simple, I guess, is have you felt that opening these conversations to kind of a non-art audience or an audience from the previous generation, have you found that to be difficult or restricting or limiting or complicated? I know, Rosemary, you had talked about kind of when you first entered drag, there was, this pushback. And I just want to know if you can kind of talk about it a little bit, just because drag is something that existed for so long and in Asian communities as well. I mean, you see like in Chinese opera, people were in drag, and in Japanese, performing, it was people were in drag. So I don't know, have you felt like there's still this kind of like, this sense of like pushback, I guess?
Yeah. So what I experienced was because when I do the Miss First Nation competition, which is like mainly for Aboriginal drag artists, drag queens to compete together. Basically, it's like a platform for us to show ourselves, and because of this, I was being told by one of the friends. I didn't know him, but he was thinking that I was taking advantage of indigenous culture into my drag, so it's like using it. So, and I feel strongly. I was very upset about this because, for me, like I said, I was trying not to do it, but I do it because of my gut and also the research I've done. I feel like this is the right time, right place, and right platform for me to do it. So I think that's one of the things that put me down. But then I think about it, it was because, not really because I talked with the friends who know him, and it was because he's also Christians. And I think there's a lot of colonizations that kind of ruin how he was. and that they made the person to say that what I did was wrong, instead of just like getting to know the core of it or the reasoning or everything. So I feel like it does have a lot of things to do with colonization, with Christianity and also Chinese culture. It's like forcing the idea of, you know, just like male and female completely separate, and thinking what we do here is just trying to make fun of the culture, of the image itself. But I think it's completely false. So it's one of the things that pushed me back at that time. But now when I decided to keep on developing this direction was because I get told by someone saying that, also a Thai, also from my tribe in different region, saying that what I did inspired them a lot. And also it speaks a lot to my heart. It's like, this is something I've been having an image in my head. So I will just go on with this. I keep on inspiring myself and the others, hopefully. Yeah.
So we have one question, but Ja, I don't know if you wanted to add on to that.
Oh, yeah, no, I just thought your sort of the experience you shared with your friend was so interesting, because I think this is something that I feel seems to come up around work based around identity, especially identities that may be considered marginalized in their context. A lot, right, is the idea that like is the fear or the criticism that people will say that you are sort of utilizing your identity like for your personal gain, right? And I don't know, I think that's really difficult, you know, because it's like, who is to say what the line between that and like taking ownership of your heritage is, right?
And also the like identity or heritage or culture is already a very complicated ideas of everything. And everyone, even Chinese, they come from like, let's say like from the south, from the north, and they already have different cultures. I don't, it's hard to kind of break that, but it's also a need to break that barriers into
Yeah.
that we believe in, like our faith.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing about that. I'm curious. If you don't mind me asking, like, is your friend also like indigenous? Like, you know, I'm just wondering where they were coming from with this, like, you know.
He is, and also actually I respect him quite a bit because
Oh, totally. Yeah, yeah.
he's one of the younger generations who would go back to the mountains to practice the real traditional way of making clothes or making like a life, and here and there. So hearing this from that is kind of like upsetting, especially
Yeah,
because
of
I have no
course.
intention. I love what he does, and he tell me in this, you know, out of the context, background, this and that. But I think this is also, as an artist, is something to go through to tell people that why we did it, what was our intention, and this and that. So yeah, it's a good experience to have, and the conversation and dialogues with people who don't understand, but also have a strong roots with our own culture, because we basically live like his tribe is right here and my tribe is basically right here, so we're pretty close.
Right.
So we'll hop on over to the questions from the audience. We have one from Steph. Have you noticed any ways in which being in quarantine has inspired or shaped your work in unexpected ways? Anybody?
Can I answer that?
You
The
can't.
what?
Oh, right, because in Taiwan there was no.
It's just like nothing happened.
Yeah. So Ja has quarantine or just, you know, being stuck indoors, has that shaped your works in unexpected ways?
Yeah. In a matter of speaking, you know, I think COVID sort of precipitated one of like the sort of longest and most stubborn art blocks that I've had in a very long time. So I think that's been interesting to kind of work through. Yeah, I think because, you know, generally, you know, art and creativity is like, you know, often a space for like meditation, contemplation, like working through things, but also sort of like a self-administered therapy, right? And so I think it's very interesting when and terrible, you know, but also interesting to feel unable to access such a huge part of me that I feel so defined by, you know. So yeah, I think there's been a lot, and I'm slowly, you know, getting back into making things, but I think it's just really shifted the paradigm of like, you know, I wouldn't say that what I made before feels like irrelevant or pointless, but that, you know, my relationship to it has just changed. And I think, I don't know, I'm curious how you feel, Rosemary. I think for me, like, you know, at least with a lot of my circles, I think this was a common thing that I heard, you know, that, yeah, there seems to be some kind of paradigm shift that is echoing in some strange way with the creative impulse.
You mean like staying in the one place and not accessing to outside world? Or
yeah, I think maybe the sort of, I think, you know, for context, I also moved back to Singapore for most of the worst of COVID. And, you know, it was interesting. I mean, I think like, you know, so much of my adult life is defined by, you know, being with my queer community in New York and you know, being in this sort of independent setting and sort of going back into this society that, you know, was my hometown, was so formative for me, but also where I felt so like unseen and unable to find community in some way, right? I think, yeah, I think really showed me how much I associate this sort of like extremely like high productivity, you know, like generative self with dislocation and my kind of like, you know, independent like queer niche, right? Yeah, but you know, it's been humbling, I guess. You know, I think like it's not the first time I've been through like a block like this. It's been a long time, but I guess, you know, sometimes maybe it's just a cycle of things that you forget how to do things, or it feels like it, right? And you have to kind of rework your way into it.
exactly. And also it's like I think that people or things that surrounding you around you really make you change your perspective of things and especially your direction of doing things. Especially I don't know how it is outside because we're basically in a fairyland when nothing happens.
A
We don't
working
know what happens.
infrastructure, yes.
Yeah, we still work, we still go to the
Yeah.
beach, we still have fun. But I feel like, yeah, it's like around surrounding by different environments and people, it does give you a new idea to redevelop what you think and also rejuvenate it with a rest or it's like take a break to think about what's your direction for the future. So I think it's for me it's all positive to have a blog to think about because like if you have a blog so you need to find a way to break it. So you create,
Right. I need to think about why it's happening, right?
yeah, so it's like you create another things for us or for you, for everyone to think about it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you know, I do think that like it's a larger reckoning, I think that many, again, like, you know, trade people who are in my circles have been kind of discussing is like, well, I think we've always known that this attachment to productivity is like, you know, inherently like a, you know, something of like a capitalist brainwashing thing. But it is also like a comfort blanket, right? Like it's a, you know, it's a coping mechanism, it's a security blanket, right? And it is a very easy but also lazy marker of self, right?
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
It
So
totally makes sense.
So we have one other question from Lucia, and I think it's like kind of a nice way to wrap up kind of our conversation because we are hitting the you know, close to the hour mark. What was the journey to decolonizing your mind of the Western concept of gender like? So I know in Jia for you, you know, when you subvert the characters or the roles of the characters in your work, I wonder what that process was like, because we talked about translation, we talked about you know, reinterpretation, I guess you could say, or, you know, reimagining of an alternative. What was that process like? What was that journey like? Did you find that you were battling not only with conversations with your peers, or maybe, you know, those from the older generation or outside the art circle, but did you feel like there was a complication, an inner kind of conflict that you were going through? Or did you feel that for the most part it was exciting and, you know, in kind of that positive way? It was like, I want to, you know, break things? Or did, you know, was there tension, or was it more like going on an adventure? I know that I'm like dumbing things down or
Oh, no, absolutely. Those are, you know,
yeah.
that absolutely resonates. You know, I think it was both, as many things usually are. I think, you know, in this sort of more abstracted intellectual sense, you know, when I was researching, right, when I was kind of finding the little anchor points within the source material, that was exciting. You know, that is the adventure part, I think, you know, or the fun adventure part, right? Like the camping trip adventure part, you know, where it's like, you know, Russell Crowe in like a beautiful mountain with the red string, right? You're like, oh, it's connected. Like, yeah, that makes sense, right? And this idea of wanting to, I really resonated with what Rosemary said, you know, about this wanting to push back against this very male-dominated point of view of Chinese culture at large, you know, even within our stories, you know, I mean, Journey to the West, what is the story at its core? It's a band of brothers who get together, you know, and they attain like sainthood through the shunning and maiming and killing of women, right? You know, all the demons, you know, want to fuck them and want to eat them, right? You know, or they're like, you know, untouchable like goddess figures, right? Who like drop by to like, you know, give like a magic headband or whatever, you know, and so like what does it look like for like the messiness, you know, and the complexity of the disciples and their sort of wayward crying like master, you know, to be like a woman, to be queer, to be like in family together, right, and fighting, you know, and I think, you know, this was kind of what excited me about the idea of like the re-envisioning the trickster, right, is that I think the trickster in their liminality and their ambiguity, that's what makes them human. That's what makes them endearing to us, you know? And I think the inability to envision anyone but like kind of like a cis man as this kind of character speaks to like how we gatekeep, like, you know, who is deemed like fully human, who gets to embody the fullness of their humanity. Right.
But that's so lovely, because I mean, when Rosemary was talking about performing at the Polima, you know, first Miss Nation Taiwan, and she was talking about performing a traditionally male sung song as, you know, but dressed as, you know, in drag as a female. There is something about that where you're like exploring what lies beyond the boundaries. But in a respectful way, though. It's not like science fiction. It's not like completely absurd or anything. It's still, there's like an association to like humanity and what makes us kind of connected, you know, in the core of it all, which I find like super beautiful. But yeah, so,
there's like an intention behind it.
Yeah, exactly. It's not a gimmick. You know, I do think I was like super shocked, Rosemary, also when I heard that, like, you know, you had a friend who was like, oh, you can't do it this way, or like you're using it. I'm like, well, you know, I think it's really interesting when we talk about breaking gender roles, or, you know, trying to like move beyond that and how that gets perceived. It's like, is it all a trick? Is it all just like some sort of show and performance and that's it? Like, what's the intention behind it? And so I think it's like kind of beautiful when you talk about that, Jia. Like, I can see that translate over in Rosemary's work too. So yeah, Rosemary, I don't know if you want to kind of jump in and talk about what that journey for you was like, how it was, you know, that journey of saying like, okay, I don't want to prescribe to this like Western concept anymore. Again, I know that we had talked about like, you know, the conversations with your parents, and like, that was really tough, but like for you, was that journey also liberating? Was it like freeing, or was there a lot of conflict?
For me, it's like I would just put it like this is how it's supposed to be, and I happen to be in a. I'm pretty lucky to have a family that supports me in almost every different way. Instead, like pretty proud of me. I was like, actually, she wants to join the Zoom talk, but she didn't know how it works. But I was there, so I was just like, whatever. But the thing is, like, I'm lucky to have, yeah. And what am I trying to say now? Let me think. So it's just like for me, basically, it's not just like a Western concept of gender because obviously in Chinese culture, Aboriginal culture, they say mine, it's very hugely male and female, and I think my journey for that has been successful because I just believe that what I do, and usually things that come back and tell me is that what I did was right. So it's not too much struggle personally, maybe because that's how my mindset is already, and also because of doing this, let's say drag with Aboriginal and anything identity, it gives me a lot more that I expected. So for me, everything is fine. And I'm just strongly believe in faith. If you believe in doing something, it will come out in the end. Yeah, even though it didn't answer much, but this is how I feel about this question.
Actually, something Jacqueline that you said really struck me. The idea of that it's not just a gimmick or a show or a performance. I'm really curious how you feel about this, Rosemary, because sometimes I almost wonder like, what if yes, like it is, like because I don't know, like thinking about the role of like humor or entertainment in work and how that sometimes is a way that ideas are conveyed in like on a very gut level, right? Like without really having to pontificate on it, like, I don't know, I sort of think about, like you were talking about the reception of work and how do older generations react. And I think, often when they've seen my sort of this particular project of like retelling and queering and feminizing and like sexualizing, right? Like, bringing this element of sex back in, they kind of laugh, like they think it's right. They think it's funny, but part of me is also like, that doesn't really bother me because I'm like, yeah, a monkey with breasts is kind of funny, like a monkey like shaving its legs, like with a hairy crotch is like sort of funny, like, and I don't know, I'm just very curious what your thought around like that sort of reception is, Rosemary, just because, I think that like so much of like drag, at least like, in the popular Western understanding is sort of embedded, as you said, right, in camp, in entertainment, and this idea of like, almost like the vulgar, but in a very subversive way, right?
Because I cannot like fully answer that because like in Taiwan, it's just completely different scenario comparing to Western culture and even China or other countries. Just like people.
What is the context like? Sorry, not to interrupt you.
Okay, so basically it's like Taiwan is like everything you do, if they love it, they'll say you're amazing. And if you don't like it, they wouldn't come to you and say, I hate it. So all we heard is just good stuff and positive stuff. So we don't really receive a lot of bad things and here and there, or we'll make it funny. For example, like my mom would say that you look ugly in drag. And I was just like, you too, bitch. But just kidding, like we just joke around a lot. But it's just like I didn't really receive anything except the one experience I told you guys about with what I do was wrong. But usually people were fascinated by the fact I incorporate Aboriginal influences into my drag because I think the drag is not too popular, not very known in Taiwan, and second, also Taiwanese Aboriginal culture was not being too known in Taiwan as well. They're just like, oh, we are Aboriginal, we are Yuanzhumin, we are this people, but they don't really know much about this. So it's just like, in a way, what they see was what they receive.
Mhm.
So it's hard to really think about something else. Yeah,
Mhm.
it's very different. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for being here and for speaking with with me and with with our live audience. I'm going to wrap this up just because we are kind of at the end of our session. But yeah, thank you guys so much for joining me, and I'll pass this over to Inez to put in final words.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. That was so delightful and so incredibly interesting. Like so many more questions. Thank you for spending the time with us today, and please come and follow us and like us on our Facebook, Instagram, or send us a message on our website. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.